Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, the coronavirus pandemic has reignited tensions between America and China. Neither side can afford an all-out conflict. How is the Cold War likely to be resolved? This week was the first full week that England's property sector opened up for business. The next few months have been described as a buyer's market, but with consumer confidence at an all-time low, is the sector heading towards a crash? And later on in the show, we'll also be heading back to northern Italy, where after almost 3 months of lockdown, the hospitality sector is back up and running. Before those discussions, here's some other business news from across the globe. This week, the Japanese economy officially entered into recession for the first time in 4.5 years. The GDP of the world's third largest economy contracted by 3.4% between January and March, capturing the early effects of the COVID-19 lockdown. The data reveals that production, exports and consumer spending are all down in Q1. According to some analysts, the economy may see a contraction of up to 20% this year. Last week, the British government released certain restrictions to start the recovery of the housing market. Estate agents have now reopened. Viewings can take place and removal firms can now properly assist new homeowners. It's estimated that 450,000 transactions were put on hold after the market was put into a deep freeze during the COVID-19 outbreak. For more on this, I'm now being joined by Ugo Arinze, the managing director of London-based property company Onyx Property Consultants. Ugo Arinze, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Were you taken back that last week there was a sudden announcement by the UK government that the UK property sector would be at the heart of the British economy by deciding to open the sector up so quickly?
We were very surprised. I mean, we had been given a notice that we probably would be one of the leading industries at the forefront of opening up. But to go from the Prime Minister's speech on Sunday to then getting the alert Tuesday night that as of the next day or instantly, we were able to start conducting business, there wasn't any kind of real lead up. So we were very surprised that it was that sudden.
Of course, before COVID-19, the market was booming. Confidence was back. There had been the dithering of Brexit, but it seemed as if once we had decided to leave, that the consumer confidence had returned. Then COVID-19 struck. What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of months? Do you think there will be some anxiety amongst people just to part ways with their money?
Well, I think there's a couple of dynamics in play right now. Yes, you're going to have some buyers who might have been very confident in February, given their job outlook, who might now no longer be as confident. And so those buyers might pull out of the market and say, we have to wait and see simply because we're no longer as confident. What we have seen since just in the last week is an extreme pent-up demand on the part of sellers to put their listings on the market, but also on the part of buyers. And I think that's a function of some buyers have been cooped up for several months and all of a sudden discovered that perhaps the flat that they were happy living with is no longer suitable, especially if they're going to be working from home on a long-term basis and those dynamics have changed. So we have to wait and see. Across the industry, estimates are that there's going to be a pullback, but right now we're going to, make hay while the sun shines, as they say.
Of course, not just those of us in Britain, but across the world, most people have been working from home. And there is some data out from Hitachi Capital UK, which suggests that 55% of workers in your sector want to continue working from home. I know that you've been doing it because, of course, you're the managing director of your own company, Onyx Property Consultants. Do you see that's where the industry is going? What would you say are some of the worries or concerns that managers may have? And what are some of the benefits?
Well, again, working for myself, I have always split my time. We have a physical office in Victoria, but I've also worked from home. I think the big concern under the traditional high street agency model is that you have employees, and are those employees going to still be working efficiently from home? And I think that has yet to be proven. However, certainly at the higher level and when it's your own business, you're going to be hustling. You're going to be working really hard. So I think the traditional high street model may suffer simply simply because so many of them are employees of the estate agency, and are they really going to be working productively versus sitting in that high street agency shop and having to be on the phone and making those calls, where at home nobody can control that right now, especially if volume might be slightly down.
Of course, we've got a lot of viewers around the world, particularly in Nigeria, and many of them who were fortunate enough do love a second home here in the capital. But there's no denying, Ugo, there are worries, there are concerns. And one of the main issues we have here is, of course, at the end of the year, we've got Brexit to deal with. Brexit, remember that word? How would you ease some of the concerns from overseas buyers who kind of say Britain is written off at the moment?
I wouldn't say Britain's written off at all, because half the people who are saying that have their own set of domestic issues, right? So they're sitting in a place where they might be heavily oil dependent, and their financial situation has also taken a hit. What I feel like in London, and fundamentally, the fundamentals are strong for Great Britain. You still have a place that, especially in London, there's a chronic housing shortage. So when we look at any business, we have to look at supply and demand, and we just don't have enough housing for the population, even if it takes a correction. And we're talking about housing as a tangible asset. You have a bricks and mortar asset versus what is the alternative investment option? You're putting it into the stock market that all its gains can be wiped out overnight. And it's not to say that the property market might not see price declines, but at the end of the day, you're still working with a physical, tangible asset, which is housing, which people still fundamentally need. And when you look at the rule of law, when you look at the dynamics of the UK market, in comparison to most other countries, it is still very stable. So it is still a place that I think, if you can afford it, it's still a place that makes for a viable investment option. So I think people need to
if you can afford it is the key thing there. I've got to ask you before you go, because you are a property expert, Ugo. Where are the places to buy for the vast majority of us who are saving their pennies and can't live in some of the more opulent places in London and across England? Where would you say are some of the key up-and-coming areas where you could bag a fortune?
Well, I wrote an article on my YouTube channel that we talked about East London being a much more affordable part of London with great transport links. So if you're looking out towards Stratford and things like that, you will find pockets. Places like Catford or or Lewisham that people might have written off in the past should be reconsidered. However, there are places in zones 2 and 3 where I think, again, for that savvy buyer, you will find opportunities now. And so it's not easy by any means, but if people are looking diligently and repeatedly, they might find that opportunity. And I would encourage them to make an offer, because, a seller might consider an offer today that they might not have considered 6 months ago.
Absolutely. Well, Ugo Arinze, thank you so much for that property expert advice. And do join us back on Channel's Business Global again, hopefully in the studio next time. Thank you, Ugo.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
On the surface, it may appear that the escalating tensions between Beijing and Washington is about who's to blame for coronavirus becoming a global mess. However, analysts believe that both sides are drawing battle lines in longer-term disputes about global economic and political leadership. The virus has weighed heavily on both countries, plunging their economies into the deepest contractions for decades and destroying tens of millions of jobs. President Donald Trump's recent threat of new tariffs on China and suggestions from Beijing that it could counter with other dramatic punitive actions are adding to the tensions. For more on this, joining me via Skype in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, is market analyst Han Tan from Forex Time Limited. Han Tan, thanks so much for joining us on Channel's Business Global. There's no denying, even amongst those of us that are not necessarily news savvy, that this pandemic has really escalated the tensions between America and China. What's gone wrong?
I think what we're seeing here is the sheer need for political capital, right? Because if you recall, coming into this year, you had a U.S. president that was flying high, politically speaking at least. The U.S. economy was in a much better place compared to its major peers. Then in January, the U.S. and China signed a trade deal, but this COVID-19 pandemic has just pulled the rug from under him. We are now seeing the U.S. economy in a recession, over 20 million jobs lost in the month of April alone. And also, President Trump seems like he needs a scapegoat right now. And that's why we're seeing the potential return of tariff man, so to speak. He needs something to galvanize his voter base between now and November.
I think that's a thorough analysis there. So clearly it seems to be power that's dominating the tensions. And as you mentioned as well, trade, those tariffs are set to increase. There are concerns that this could even potentially turn into a full-blown conflict. But I would say that WHO, the World Health Organization, appear to be at the center of this. Would you not say that some of the concerns that the US President Donald Trump has could be valid?
Well, I guess it would be valid within the nationalistic sentiment or within that context that he employs. Now, granted, that is a context that is not new and it's not born out of the COVID-19 pandemic. This kind of sentiment predates it, actually, and we are seeing it in the current U.S. administration, the current UK administration, and also in pockets of Europe as well. I think these are concerns that he may have on the domestic front is not necessarily shared on the global stage, at least in terms of those who still hold on to the romantic notion or seemingly romantic notion of globalization, especially in this kind of environment.
Absolutely. But, let's put this into context here. The US and China are the world's two biggest economies. COVID-19 has ravaged both of theirs. Is it unlikely that they'll try and find some sort of resolve? Is it likely that we'll try to see interventions from, G7 members, or is it already out of control?
I think any kind of intervention from the likes of G7 will be relatively muted at this point, because what we're seeing right now is that respective countries are having their own internal battles to face, not just economically speaking, but also when it comes to the human cost, right? So I think it's harder now for any intervention to succeed. And it's not just because of the nationalist sentiment that I alluded to earlier, but also because the very nature of the pandemic is, like you pointed out, disrupting many of these global links, these global ties. So supply chains, for example, have been disrupted. Tourism has been halted, right? So it's forcing many economies to be more inward looking, to rely on more domestic drivers of growth. So in a twisted way, this global pandemic has really threatened the narrative surrounding globalization, or at least intra-economy aid, or at least some kind of policy continuity across countries and economies.
Let me ask you one last question before you go, Han. You're in Kuala Lumpur. How is Chinese relationships in the wider region? I've got to say, in the global north, in the west, not that great. Lots of blame game, including, accusations of hacking into some vaccination laboratories, hacking into the budget airline EasyJet. Are things smooth where you are?
Well, I don't think the narrative, and this is from my own perspective here, the narrative hasn't really reached those levels yet. I think there are still some very pressing bread and butter issues, so to speak. So, for example, here in Malaysia, the unemployment rate has ticked up to closer to 4%, whereas the norm for the unemployment rate here in Malaysia is at the lower range of 3%. So with the livelihoods of many Malaysians affected, and with businesses shutting down, with SMEs now at risk, I think there are more pressing concerns, more so than partaking in this kind of blame game that perhaps some folks in the West are more accustomed to right now.
Absolutely. I suppose they're trying to, put the focus on anything other than those shockingly high death counts. But Han Tan, thank you so much for joining us on Channel's Business Global. Thank you. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, nearly 3 months after embarking upon one of the world's strictest lockdowns, Italy is returning to normal, but can they? I'll be discussing this and more after the break. Welcome back to Channels Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. 2 months ago, Italy was the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. During the peak, there were periods when more than 1,000 people were dying every single day. 10 weeks on, more than 31,000 people have died, and authorities hope that the first wave of infections has indeed passed. The economy is now beginning to reopen, and friends and family can wine and dine and socialise again. For more on this, I'm now being joined by video journalist Alex Fraser, who's in Milan. Alex Fraser, thank you so much for joining me back on Channels Business Global. We spoke a couple of months ago. You're in Italy. I would expect you to be a little bit more brown, but of course you haven't really been out. But the lockdown measures have been lifted. Bars and restaurants are open. Have you been out, and how are Italians, reacting to this new normal?
Well, the situation here is that where I live here in Lombardy, things are back open, but not everything. By law, they can reopen, but there's very, very strict measures in doing so. Many restaurants have plastic dividers between customers, even between people from the same family. So it's not quite the pleasant al fresco dining experience you'd come to hope for from Italy. Now, the government's doing a lot to help local businesses open up out onto the street a bit more to kind of ease the pressure of having so many people inside restaurants. But because of the very strict measures, it's not the most pleasant experience for people, and as a result, we expect more businesses to suffer. If you take a walk around the city here, and bear in mind Milan's one of the most affluent parts of Italy, many shops aren't open, the shutters are closed. A lot still have those paper notes outside saying that they're closed due to the coronavirus, and some may not open again. So it is a new normal, but it's going to be some tough months to come, I'm sure.
Talk about it being uncomfortable. I'm here in London. Gosh, I would love a socially distanced dinner with friends, but I can imagine it will be very different. Is there any coronaphobia? Can you feel that? There has been some data released from the Office for National Statistics, and YouGov have released polls, and apparently Brits are the most worried about going out. There's a huge row at the moment about whether or not kids should be allowed back to school next month. Is that one of the issues that Italian businesses are facing?
I think to an extent, yes. I mean, what we've seen here is schools actually won't reopen until September at the earliest here. That's been set in stone. So the same kind of arguments about education aren't going to happen, and many universities will have to be online for the next year or so. In terms of being out, are people worried to be out? Well, the place I would say where you can kind of tell is public transport. So a concern of many people were that because of the social distancing measures, fewer people are allowed on trains, on buses, on trams in the cities. And you'd think that means you'd start to have queues coming out of the stations and issues like that, which I know we've seen in London. But that's not been the case here. So that, to me, says that fewer people are taking public transport because they may be worried about contracting the virus or more maybe working from home. But that's one of the things that I've seen here, particularly in Italy.
Yeah, that is a key factor. And as you said, there have been some pretty shocking images, actually, of London trains as packed as they were when you were in London working in the city. But 31,000 dead, it's an alarming figure. Of course, when we spoke, Britain was nowhere near that. We've rocketed past Italy. But now I presume the focus is on the economy, is on trying to put the confidence back into the consumer, to get people out doing business again. Are there concerns that perhaps, it's going to take a very long time?
There's huge concerns. I mean, Italy is a country that that's not exactly even in economic terms. I mean, there are many, many poor cities, poor regions, as well as the rich ones. And everywhere is going to take a considerable hit. I mean, it was a long lockdown, and it was probably one of the most strictest in Europe. People weren't allowed to leave the house apart from one trip to the supermarket per week. Italy is a country that relies on small business, on face-to-face contact between consumer and shopkeepers, owners. So as a result, it's going to be very difficult. The self-employed in Italy have been granted measures by the government, which involve €600 per month. As you can imagine, for many people in many cities, that's not really comparable to the income that they were earning before this virus. So as a result, many businesses are going to suffer. Many supply lines will suffer ultimately. And it's very hard to get consumers back out and buying stuff. In Milan, we've seen the main department store here is Rinascente, is very famous around the world. That's selling goods at 50% of the price. So many places are using sales to entice people in, but I think it's still going to be very, very hard for a number of months to come. And particularly with those phobias of a second peak of the virus, many people won't be out doing their usual habits, shopping as such.
That second peak is haunting everyone. We've seen cases on the rise in Germany, South Korea and China. Talking about a second peak, June the 14th, that's when borders will be open again to tourists. There has been some controversy here in the UK because Prime Minister Boris Johnson said anybody coming in will have to go into 14 days of quarantine. That means you're likely to have a 4-week holiday. I don't think any bosses will be allowing that in this climate. Do you think it's too soon for Italy to open its doors to tourists, particularly as they've said no quarantine? If you want to come, we're open to having you.
I think it's a question of how you interpret the data, because Italy, the big issue with the outbreak here is it's actually really been concentrated on one region, Lombardy. There has been cases in other regions, but nothing like the scale of death and the numbers that we've seen here. There are some regions now that are reporting 0 new cases. So it's very hard to impose a national block on borders in certain regions and not others. So the question the government face here is, do you wreck tourism in a country because some regions still have new cases? It's very hard to create a bubble where you enter in one region perhaps to go to the beach and then you go back to the UK to be quarantined, etc. And as a result, the government has big decisions to make. Do you let people come into a country where there are still new cases in some regions, but there aren't in others? So that's the challenge that the Italian government faces, but it's under a lot of pressure. I mean, don't get me wrong, the parties on the right very much pushing for things to reopen, and a lot of this country in many regions really, really depends on tourism. And if the beaches are empty this summer, it means the restaurants are empty this summer, the cafes are empty this summer, the hotels are empty this summer, and as a result, you then have a huge economic crisis. So I don't think it's a case of putting health first or the economy first, but it's a difficult balance that is going to have to be struck here.
Absolutely, and it's a difficult balance most of the world, particularly the global north, are facing. Just very briefly before you go, Alex, how are things on the ground? It's always so easy to see things in a global perspective, but how are you feeling? How are some of your colleagues, your neighbours feeling? There have been some reports, although limited, about the mafia now getting involved. What do you think are the long-lasting scars of this lockdown, particularly as Italy was one of the first to see it so drastically?
I think the major issue that most places will face now is the economics of how do you claw back the money that you've lost across the last few months. But particularly here in Lombardy and many of the small towns that have been affected, people are really just coming to terms with what's happened. I mean, there are valleys where they've seen 500 to 1,000% increase in the number of average deaths for this time of year. So many families are affected, that they're still mourning their families, and then the economy comes second after that. The good news here is the hospitals are seeing far fewer new cases, intensive care beds are clearing, but it's going to be a real challenge the next few months as Italy, in the way it's set out, in how it goes about dealing with a potential huge economic crisis and how it helps the average citizen here to survive and to thrive in Italy.
Alex Fraser from Lombardy in Italy, thank you so much for that update and joining us on Channel's Business Global. Thank you, Alex. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.